Welcome everyone. My name's Tony Gilland. I'm Chief of Staff at MCC Brussels, a think tank based in Brussels, obviously. Do check us out. We've got some great stuff on YouTube and on social media. The title for this session is Defending the West in a Dangerous World. I don't think it has a need for a great deal of introduction. It's obviously a more dangerous world that we're living in. And the question of whether the West is ready to defend itself is often brought into stark relief. I mean, here in the UK, we have two shiny new aircraft carriers that are not able to be used very often, either because the propellers broke or because we don't have sufficient support vehicles. And indeed, when we do, we don't have enough sailors. So it's very clear in the UK, at least, there are some significant issues. But let's hear from the panel about their take on this question. Essentially, is the West ready to defend itself in this dangerous world? Very pleased to have on the panel first to speak Tim Black, Dr. Tim Black on my immediate right. He's columnist and books essay editor at Spiked. He also writes for EU Observer, Australian, The Independent and La Repubblica, and he has a PhD in English. Next to Tim on his right is Sir Simon Mayall. Simon, delighted to have you with us. Simon is a consultant and writer and former Assistant Chief of the Army. So he knows what he's talking about on this topic. He's author of a book that he's just rushed here from being interviewed about on the Portillo show on GB News, a book which I urge you to check out on Amazon and help it rise further up the league, is The House of War, The Struggle Between Christendom and the Caliphate. So welcome to Simon. And then next to go will be Tim Scott on my very far left, which he says is completely inappropriate for him, but you can be the judge of that. Tim is the executive director of the Freedom Association. He's a former army captain who served both in our armed services and also with UN peacekeeping forces. And finally, no stranger to many of you, I should imagine, is Sherelle Jacobs, who's a Daily Telegraph columnist and commissioning editor on the comment desk. And in addition to Brexit and Westminster, she writes about geopolitics, helpfully for this session, technology, futurism, and bureaucracy. So please, can we welcome our panel? Okay, they've got 6 minutes each, give or take 30 seconds, and they'll get a yellow warning card when they have 1 minute to go. Tim.
Thank you, Tony. 6 minutes then. Okay, quickly, 1 minute. I'm going to start by briefly reflecting on that post-Cold War moment when the US was, I think, for perhaps nearly a couple of decades, the dominant world power. I'm talking about the so-called that moment when the US and its Western allies, usually under the auspices of NATO or the blue hats of UN, staged grandstanding interventions in the former Yugoslavia and then the Middle East and so on, and of course in Afghanistan. Now, because I think what was striking about that post-Cold War moment was just how disoriented I think Western elites were by the sudden collapse of the USSR. The disappearance, I think, of communism had deprived Western elites of a sense of who they were. And so they began using foreign policy making almost as a means to sort of find a purpose, to demonstrate a purpose, to try to solve that kind of Western identity crisis, to demonstrate a sense of moral purpose to a domestic audience. They were saying effectively, look at us bringing democracy, say, to Iraq, look at us protecting the Libyan people from a terrible dictator. This is what we as the West stand for, and this is what we are against. Now, not only did this kind of geopolitical posturing, and I think it was probably more posturing than anything else, given the kind of lack of strategic thinking behind it, not only did this sort of fail to provide Western elites with the identity and purpose they craved, it also destabilized various parts of the world and sowed the seeds of conflict, I think, which were to erupt as the West's economic and military strength started to decline and the unipolar world started to give way to our current sort of more multipolar world, a world, that is, in which Russia, China and others are seeking to establish a new balance of power. Now, this is where we are at now, in the throes of a shifting world order, a shifting balance of power. And it will, I think, almost undoubtedly cause conflict. It already is, largely because the would-be emergent powers are pushing up against and challenging that post-Cold War world order. We've seen this already in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which pushes back against the western borders of NATO and the EU. And we're seeing conflict hotting up with China, of course, not just over Taiwan, but over atolls and shoals in the South China Sea. And of course, there's the conflagration slowly enveloping the Middle East. Now, this growing geopolitical disorder has certainly left Western nations painfully exposed militarily. European nations are lacking the military capacity, I think, not only to support Ukraine at the moment, but also for their own self-defense. Just take one example, the British Army. It's now down to 70,000 troops, which is reportedly the smallest it's been since the Napoleonic era. But I think what we're seeing is more than a problem of military logistics and low levels of defence spending. It is a symptom, I'm sure other people on the panel will reiterate, it's a symptom of a much deeper problem. In some ways, the same problem, I think, that underpinned the humanitarian militarism of that older unipolar moment during the 1990s. And that's the problem, namely that Western elites have no real sense of what it is that they should stand for. If anything, I think it's even more pronounced now. This identity crisis is even more pronounced now, even more pronounced than it used to be. I think today's elites don't value the accomplishments of Western modernity, of liberty, democracy, or indeed perhaps even the nation-state itself. And as a result, they have no real sense of what it is, I think, that's worth defending. No sense of what it is that is worth fighting for. In fact, it's probably even worse than that. I think too many amongst our sort of ruling elites, they seem to actively loathe the things that are worth fighting for. A very small sort of case in point is a leaked internal document from the British Army in 2019, which I was just reading about last week. In this document, higher-ups were told to regard soldiers describing themselves as patriots or talking of national identity. They were told to regard these people as potential extremists. That's right, British officialdom was seeking to purge the British Army of the very people that think their country is worth fighting for, which I think sounds more than a little counterproductive. And there are countless other examples, true of the West's, for want of a better word, West's woke military complex, from Joe Biden telling his diplomatic corps to advance LGBTQ rights in 2021, to the UK Ministry of Defence urging staff to display their pronouns in their bios. And I think this loss of a sense of what it is that is worth defending in the West and about the West, the lack of this kind of active turn against what is valued about the West, this rot has spread from the head down. There are now large sections, I think, of Western publics, especially among the younger university-educated cohorts, who believe they know exactly. Thank you, Tony. Know exactly what the West is, and they absolutely hate it. I think from their kind of alternately identitarian and environmentalist perspective, the West is white, oppressive, and the source of the climate catastrophe. Many are more likely, I think, to side geopolitically with the West's foes than with Western nations themselves. I know there are a few readings for this session suggesting ministries of defence need to meet these youngish sort of professional activists in their own terms. I think the idea that you could forge a kind of patriotic militia from Black Lives Matter and Just Stop All activists seems more than a little fanciful. So I think for the West, indeed for Western nation states themselves, the fight to define and defend the West is well and truly on. But this fight is not to be fought and won abroad, as Western elites of the post-Cold War moment mistakenly thought. I think the fight to define and defend the West begins at home. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Tim. Simon, please.
Thank you. Well, as a soldier, but a historian by academic enthusiasm, I think key things for historians are know your facts, understand context, and be empathetic. And so I'd just like to say, to just kick off with the fact that from 450 AD, when the Roman legions left Britain, we did not build a house for pleasure in this country for 1,000 years. And only after about 1,000 years did the combination of security, stability, prosperity, and technological advance begin the domination of the West. I put the words in inverted commas. None of this is God-given. None of that dominance was God-given. None of it was anyone's by right. It was fought for and defended by generation after generation against ferocious external challenge and significant bloody internal conflicts. The West has been defined by geography, by ethnicity, by history and religion, and I would say from the 16th century, the last 500 years, by the concept of progress: religion, society, culture, learning, agriculture, industry, and technology. And this has led to the westernization of the world. It is difficult to think of a single significant material advance in the modern world that has not come from the West. And additional to that, the West has exported, globalized all the freedoms that we assume define the West. All those freedoms that we believed we were in the vanguard of, which are now being corroded from within. And it's worth remembering Teddy Roosevelt's great cry, 1910. It's not the critic who counts, or whether doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, but who does actually strive to do the deeds. He at least fails while daring greatly, so his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who never know victory nor defeat. Now, civilizations, societies, and empires are also in the arena, and their survival depends on statesman-like leadership, the prudent use of resources, the willingness of citizens to make sacrifices, and the preparedness of a military to fight and die for an idea and a cause. Those in the arena, including our ancestors, have the right to be judged in the context of their times and by the values and standards of their age, what Chesterton called the democracy of the dead. And the critics of the West, or the British Empire, dare I say, which seems fashionable at the moment, need to be confronted and challenged with the question, compared to what? Frankly, compared to what? None of us stand alone in a vacuum as a civilization or an individual. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, rather naively, and also Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization. And he identified that the West may have had a temporary dominance, but unless you're prepared to defend it, predators are all around you. However, to acknowledge Huntington's thesis meant that the West was going to have to spend money on expensive defense capabilities, and possibly even having to expend intellectual firepower in defending the West. And the championing of the West, with all its flaws, failures, crimes, foul-ups, and admit that it had been the greatest vehicle of human freedom, increased health or wealth creation in human history. However, neither Francis Fukuyama nor Samuel Huntington predicted the scale and pace of the eternal corrosion of the ideal of the West by those who had been the beneficiary of Western dominance, but were devoid of the understanding of history and context, obsessed with its flaws and failures, but susceptible to manipulation. Through a combination of complacency, intellectual indolence, a self-deprecation bordering on self-loathing, lack of convincing leadership, lack of professional competence, we now lack, to take Tim's words, a compelling narrative that confidently sets out the extraordinary achievements of the West, while also acknowledging the immediacy and lethality of the range of threats and challenges we face. We have not only failed to invest in our armed forces, but we have progressively denigrated the values, standards, and motivations of those we rely upon to protect us. We would all deprecate that expression, toxic masculinity. But for many people, that phrase is shorthand for all masculinity is toxic. Take that attitude to the Ukrainian front line and see how far it gets you. Let's recall Orwell's admonition. People sleep peacefully in their beds at night only because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf. Military spending has been looked on as an unwelcome discretionary expenditure, not what it really is, prudent investment. And Churchill, that cartoon demon of the left, wrote with regard to the military, the army is not like some limited liability company to be restricted, remodeled, liquidated, and refloated from week to week. It is not an inanimate thing, it is a living thing. Sufficiently disturbed, it will wither, dwindle, almost die. When it comes to the last serious condition, it is only revived by lots of time and lots of money. And let us be clear, most European militaries have now reached that point. What we have in the West is precious to us, we who are fortunate enough to live here in this time, and I believe its achievements and its potential achievements are vital to the well-being of all humanity. Flawed the West may be, but compared to what? The Mughals, the Mongols, the Safavids, the Ottomans, the Chinese empires, such Soviet Union, Communist Russia, Islamist death cults? The human condition is sadly one of equality, inequality, suffering, and disadvantage, but the dominance of the West in the last 500 years has done more to create the conditions, legal, ethical, and technological, to address these shortfalls than any previous dominant culture or any likely alternative. Very lastly, let us remember that man, society, civilization, we are in the arena. The West is now very firmly in the arena. We have quite enough on our hands fighting enemies and opponents, set on our physical downfall and destruction, and all the ideas of freedom and progress that define the West without the insidious and corrosive influence of Roosevelt's timid and cold souls. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much, Simon. I didn't dare to interrupt you. You're on a... Okay. Tim, please.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you very much for coming, folks. I think half the battle at this is to decide which meeting you want to go to. I should also try to remember that we're to speak for 6 to 7 minutes, not 67 minutes. So this is a great topic, and I think it's good to see the battle discussing this. Now, if we are to talk about defending the West in a dangerous world, which we need to, we might start with an uncomfortable look at some of the ways that the West might have, in a well-meaning but misguided way, contributed to that stability. NATO has kept the peace well in Europe, but I think some ill-advised and over interventions elsewhere have not always helped. And despite the bravery and professionalism of our forces, I think the ill-fated invasion of Iraq in 2003 and in Libya helped reduce both countries to chaos. On the other hand, there have been many justified and successful deployments and interventions. And as an example, I would cite the Kosovo intervention of 1999, Tony Blair's finest hour, in my view, when the West came to the aid of a mostly Muslim population, even if we did manage to inadvertently bomb the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Now, despite all this, the world does face potential and substantial threats. As Simon has already said, I haven't been reading his mail. The so-called peace dividend of the 90s and the so-called end of history, where democracy and was supposed to have universally triumphed, now look a bit naive, if well-meaning at the time. So conflicts continue in Afghanistan after the troublesome Western withdrawal there, Ukraine, where Britain has played a leading role, attempts made to delegitimize and attack Israel, China threatens Taiwan, and builds bases on unclaimed islands in territorial waters. We also continue to see so-called grey zone conflicts short of all-out full-scale war. These range from cyber attacks to targeted assassinations. But we should also look closer to home at the UK forces and at our own security. Whilst we've clearly not been a global power, a major power for many decades, if you were to draw a four-circle Venn diagram of NATO, permanent members of the UN Security Council, Europe and the Commonwealth, then I think I'm right in saying that Britain is the only country that's in all four. So we're very much at the crossroads of the world, and we have a role to play, and we should be a positive force in the world. So as an example, the AUKUS, that's Australia, UK, USA, defence and submarine deal, I thought was a very good example of this. And I well remember Boris's comments about the raucous squawkus of the anti-AUKUS caucus. Only Boris could have come up with that one. That deal will see the three countries cooperate to provide Australia with 5 nuclear-powered, note, not nuclear-armed submarines, and a rotation, hopefully, a rotation of a British or a US submarine based in Australia. Also, Japan, a friendly democracy that we would do well to keep in with, is said to be interested in joining the deal. Japan and Italy are partners with the UK on the next generation Tempest fighter plane, though we hear that inevitably there have been funding pressures. The aircraft carriers will be going out next year, or at least one of them will be, on a global deployment, although it will take most of our available ships, and we could do with some here. The Navy is down to just 9 frigates and 6 destroyers, and we're struggling for a supply ship. Nevertheless, these deployments and exercises, I think, send the right message. Don't misunderestimate us. And I was talking to Simon beforehand, and we both feel the army should be about 100,000, not 70,000. Talking of acronyms and alphabet soup, I'm a big fan of CANZUK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK. These 4 countries have much in common, and enhanced relationships between them would really help boost Western security. Giving away the strategically important Chagos Islands, I think, has been a poor move. At least Starmer has reassured us at PMQs that the Falklands and Gibraltar are safe. Bookmark that one. We can only hope so for our bases on Cyprus and other territories. Armed forces recruitment's under pressure, and not just here. Boots on the ground matter, and whilst high-tech kit is great, it can only do so much. Colonel Tim Collins has written of what he sees as too much of an overzealous pursuit of diversity in the armed forces at the expense of our forces' traditional recruiting base. It's not just about more kit. The overall offer needs to be improved, including stuff as basic as service housing. The West needs to wake up, rearm and rediscover ourselves. Diplomacy and use of soft power can only do so much, and a weak West is asking for trouble. We found out this week that North Korean troops may be heading for Ukraine. How many more clues do we want? Defence spending of 2.5% of GDP needs to be the floor, not the ceiling. We currently spend about 2.25%. May we need to go to 3%. Some of the NATO freeloaders, including Germany, are getting the message, but Spain, Italy, and Canada are barely spending 1.5%. So here's my final point. For how much longer can we comfortably rely on our prosperous lifestyles, secured in many ways by the sacrifice of previous generations? How long can we continue to take them for granted if we're not prepared to defend them?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Tim. Finally, Sherelle, please.
I was really pleasantly surprised to be invited to speak on this panel because I don't know anything about tanks, full disclosure. So if there are any sort of military questions, then they're probably best directed at other people
Never
qualified.
Trump.
But I know a little bit about geopolitics. I'm not going to actually talk too much about geopolitics in my introduction. I'm going to talk more about the West's existential crisis and how that undermines its geopolitical coherence, commitment and power in a dangerous world, because the battlefield is not just out there, it's actually in here. The elephant in the room is that if the West is going to defend itself and defend so-called liberal principles, then it's going to have to redirect massive public spending away from domestic things towards defence. This is at a time of stagnation, when hip surgeries are being cancelled because of sewage leaks in hospitals, and at a time when it actually takes longer to get from London to Boston, Lincolnshire by train than it takes to fly from London to Boston into USA. So let's be real here about the trade-offs, because this is about tanks versus trains, artillery versus ICU beds. There is a big problem right now, and that is that the West doesn't know what it stands for, and it doesn't know why that is worth defending. Now, during the Cold War, it was clearer what the West stood for and why it was worth defending. It stood for freedom in the face of oppression. It stood for the organicism of self-regulating free markets in the face of the arrogance of central planning. It stood for the romance of the rugged individual versus the divine collective. And this, of course, is a Disney sharp-ish simplification, and not everyone agreed on the story, to say the least, at the time. But the point is that that didn't really matter. What mattered is that elites believed it, and a decent proportion of the public also believed it. And that helped to justify what were impressive levels of defense spending during the Cold War. And today, I would say that the story of who the West is and why it's worth defending isn't so clear-cut. Somehow the claim that it stands for freedom does have less power. There is a widespread belief in Western civilization now that it was founded on slavery and it was founded on protectionism rather than liberty. There is also a widespread belief that freedom is actually a soiled ideal, that it represents this kind of reckless, selfish egoism that actually poses a threat to civilization. And I think we saw that discourse really emerge and start to crystallize during the pandemic. And other values, such as equality and diversity, actually have more salience. And there isn't the same sense of clarity, I would say, with ideals like equality. There isn't a sense of clarity that these are distinctively Western. So freedom is no longer this kind of uniting principle. And I think that we're losing sight of the fact that freedom is not merely sort of a polemical passion, sort of a fetish on the right, but it's actually a very pragmatic civilizational recipe. It is quite simply the modern West's secret sauce. But in order to make that, once again, a mainstream unifying idea, I think three things need to happen. I'm going to whiz through them because I'm running out of time. But three intellectual tasks. So the first is that freedom lovers need to achieve some collective clarity on where the neoliberal doctrine on freedom went right and where it went wrong. This is partially a task of economics, but in my opinion, this is also a task of putting economics in its place. And it's time to actually challenge the Cold War liberal orthodoxy that economic freedom is the foundation stone of liberty and replace it with the insight that it's actually freedom of thought and freedom of speech. That is the wellspring from which other freedoms flow. And just the example of the Industrial Revolution, that was preceded by an epoch of a radical new culture of hereticism, of inquiry, exploration, experimentation, and questioning of established ideas. And secondly, I think that we also need a project that is going to salvage some of freedom's historical credibility. Now, what the past few years has taught us is that history is a battlefield in the West. And I think that it's time for an equivalent, a response to the New York Times' 1619 project. The latter, of course, it aims to reframe America's history by placing the consequences of slavery at the very center of the American national and, by extension, liberal international narrative. Now, this needs to be countered by a fresh, nuanced understanding of the West's history, which acknowledges that the West's grand narrative has, for the large part, been a stumbling, schizophrenic groping towards freedom. And actually, if you were going to do a graph of tracking freedom over the last 500 years, you would have impressive peaks and you would have quite mortifying troughs. But the bottom line is that there is this undeniable embracing and diffusion of freedom. And we need to find a way to tell that story again. And thirdly, I think we also need a vision of a liberated future, which we can go out and sell to the next generation. I call them the AI generation, because I think that one of the reasons why people find sort of eco-populism so bewitching is that this vibrant, sensorious substitute for futuristic fantasizing that people just aren't connecting with in terms of what is coming out of Silicon Valley. And I think that there needs to be, in particular, a clarity about what kind of AI superpower does the West want to be, and why is it different to the kind of AI superpower that is emerging in China? You know, China, this sort of hyper-safe, hyper-controlled Shangri-La, where you've got cameras that can analyze 100 faces a second, and no criminal can escape, but also no person who disagrees with, the CCP can escape either. And I think one thing that we have to talk about is how AI can actually unleash human creativity and complement human creativity rather than seeing it as an intelligence to replace and survey humankind. And I've got the red card, so I'm going to stop. But I do want to say, I do find myself asking whether, had Putin dared to attempt what he did, would China be planning to be military ready to invade Taiwan by 2027? Did they not smell a kind of ideological decay and a collapsing confidence in the West? That's why I think it's really, really important that we have this urgent kind of mission to try and find this kind of unifying philosophy that we can all actually come together and support, that will give us the strength in order to make the sacrifices that we're going to need to make.
Thank you, Sherelle.
Before you put your hands up, I know you definitely get in, but I do want to ask one question of the panel, just one question, because it's very, very stark. You've talked about the urgency of the situation. Simon, you've said we are in the arena. But you also said it's going to take a long time and a lot of money. And when I listen to the existential crisis Sherelle lays out and the 3 conditions we need to meet, who's got the answers to those? So how do you balance this need for, if you like, a spiritual reawakening and a really deep political and philosophical argument with the urgency, the immediacy of the situation? How do we navigate our way through this?
Well, the extraordinary thing is for the Americans, who are often never faced with great strategic problems, challenges, because their bloody economy is so strong and it continues to grow and it can continue to make bad decisions on spending its money. We can't any longer. We are, as Sherelle says, and a number of us know, that we're going to have to make sacrifices to input. So it comes back to we are in a very bad situation where to actually give ourselves the wherewithal, a lot of which is to demonstrate to the Americans, who ultimately underpin all our prosperity and security, that we are serious about doing our bit. The only really serious people at the moment are the Poles. We're either going to have to make really difficult decisions, which I see absolutely no chance under this current government, or we're going to have to grow the economy, and I still see no chance of that. So somewhere along the line, we have really got to, find a way through this. Right. But this is why we're in a particularly bad situation, where we've got debt, we've got a deficit that we're paying more money on servicing the debt than we're paying on defence and education. We've got no growth in the economy, and as I say, we're in the arena, and we're getting surrounded by Gladiator 2 type enemies.
Okay. Tim, can you help us out?
Tony, just for me to be clear, you're asking how do we balance the need to sort of wage a kind of cultural struggle to revive, Western, to revive a sense of the West's value, right? At the same time with the urgent military imperatives, is that?
Yes, and perhaps balance is the wrong word, but, how do we navigate this difficult situation where, as Tim's just argued, we've got no chance of improving the economy, no chance of improving the military in the next 5 years under the existing government, and Sherelle said China's declared it wants to take Taiwan in 27. So I'm just trying to bring a bit of reality into the situation.
Well, China is not it's not an irrational actor. I don't think it will take Taiwan in 2027. There is a degree of time. We're not on the brink of World War III, despite what certain politicians over the past year have been talking about. Like, I think it was Grant Shapps who talked about us being a pre-war moment. And there has been that kind of rhetoric, this kind of, we are in the, World War is just around the corner. Now, I actually don't think that helps, largely because the rhetoric seems completely at odds with the reality and wherewithal of not just this Labour administration, but also the Tory administration before it. That at the same time as they talk about the oncoming threat, the catastrophic, imminent threat of China and Russia, they talk it up at the same time as Simon just pointed out, in terms of investment in domestic infrastructure, let alone military spending, it's minimal. The rhetoric never lives up to any kind of actual political will to invest in vital services, including defence. So I would caution against the catastrophism. I think that's the main thing. I've in terms of a culture war and the imperatives of defence, I think those two things you just have to do simultaneously. I don't think there's a massive. I think we need to spend more on defence. I'm not going to sit here and say we need X number more troops because I'm not a military strategist. I'm not going to say we need these types of missiles if we're going to. That's not what I'm here for. I think there needs to be some much needed investment in defence, but I think the key battle is to actually justify why we need that defending on defense, right? So you have to make the case for it. And in making the case for it, you then start to address what it is worth defending, right? Look, I think the two go hand in hand is my long-winded.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. Sherelle, then Tim, then out to the audience.
I think part of me thinks that the West is actually going to have to be tested. I think something's going to have to happen in order for, the message to be delivered that we are, we are on the precipice. And, there's various scenarios that you can think. I mean, to be honest, the elephant in the room is that Ukraine has lost the war. No one wants to say it, no one wants to admit it, but I think that it is clear. It's clear to me that Russia is advancing on the Eastern Front and it is losing 1,200 troops today, and it doesn't matter. It has an army that is... Ukraine's army is a fifth of the size of the Russian army, and without some kind of game-changing weaponry from the West, sort of high-precision, long-range missiles, this is not going to change. So it could be Ukraine and, Russia's presence in that country being permanent. That could be a wake-up call. I think another wake-up call could be China's invasion of Taiwan. It could already do that tomorrow. We know that while it would take the US about 24 hours to respond, it will take 14 hours for China to dominate Taiwan. And I think also the other scenario is Iran weaponizing its nuclear capability. And the Israel Middle East conflagration is quite interesting because there is an argument that what Iran is doing is trying to distract from what it is doing in terms of its nuclear program, and he is trying to drag Israel into a regional war so that it is not sort of on the front foot with what it's doing, because it's got this sort of window of a few years before. Actually, I mean, Iran is on the brink of economic collapse, so it's got a very small window, the Ayatollahs, in which to do this. So they're really ramping up. So all three of those scenarios, I think, could be the wake-up call that we need. But I don't think that we are going to suddenly decide that we're going to spend X amount on defence just because we've had some kind of epiphany.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Tim. And then we're out to the audience.
Thank you. Yes, I've been worried for some while that it might take some sort of major diplomatic or military or security reversal or embarrassment or downright defeat to actually wake us up. As Churchill once said, we never see the writing on the wall because we've always got our backs to it. I think the West is in that position now, and as Gandalf was told, the hour is later than you think. So there's no easy solutions here. I mean, what that reversal might be, I don't know. I think the troublesome, and I'm being polite there, the troublesome withdrawal from Afghanistan, the invasion of Ukraine, even North Korean troops coming. Does it have an element to a complacent West that well it's all a bit over there, it's not quite. I don't know what has to happen to wake us up. I mean, I'm not quite sure, but I think we need something.
Okay, thanks ever so much. Right, have your hands up. We've got the microphones.
Got two questions. One is, what impact would Harris victory versus a Trump victory have, do you think, on the questions we're discussing here? And the other is, how important is nuclear deterrent in this context, and specifically the British nuclear deterrent?
I did want to ask a question, like, what would you do in terms of stopping the elites from destroying the West? Because to my understanding, the elites have done a great job in promoting the idea that it's bad for us to be British or bad for us to have Enlightenment values. The elite have done a great job in deindustrialization of our country, spreading poverty and all the things that goes against Western values and the way how a civilization is built. So what should we do to prevent the elite from doing... Basically, you get the point now, but yeah.
The UK has demilitarized. Culturally, as a society, we don't have contact with the armed forces and we don't have a broad understanding of the military. Could this be part of the problem?
Hello. I was wondering if the panel could speak about the illegal immigration that happens both in the UK and in America, and of military-aged men, which some people have labelled as an invasion.
Thank you. It is just a short question. I was wondering if the panel, in light of the question of the culture of the West, have any thoughts on the teaching of history in schools. And in context, again, I ask this being quite astounded at the indoctrination of my daughter and the prescribed thinking she's expected to regurgitate in exams to get good marks. I seem to have spent the last 12 years trying to de-indoctrinate her with the correct facts and the freedom to speak out loud at home.
There's a lot of talk about the West and kind of how that needs to unite, but is it not worth thinking about maybe like a multi-polarity society, like more communication across rather than just military dominance?
Hi, this is a question for Simon. How would you deal with the wokeness in the army to increase the numbers from 70,000 to over 100,000 would be great. And my second question is, my background is in cybersecurity, and there have been cases where, hackers from rogue nations like North Korea or Russia or China they'd be messing about with devices, and then military personnel would unwittingly turn them on, and then that would expose them to their locations or everything else that's important to national security. So how would the MOD or perhaps the Army deal with that? Because how can you check if that's going to happen or not?
And just going to first principles, shouldn't we look within where the rot, I think, is occurring? If we can't even defend our own borders, our own integrity, and that's down to kind of political elites, Labour Tory governments, BBC gaslighting us over many years, then I think that's where we have to start before we can even think about external invasions.
We seem to be talking about the West like having a collective identity. And if so, what is this identity? Is this a civilizational identity? Is it a cultural identity? Sometimes we refer to the West as the Western liberal democracy. So I suppose liberty, democracy are some characteristics or values that we flourish in. What do we call the West? And if this is the West and has a collective identity, then if we take it to a more geopolitical or military aspect, let's say, is NATO the West? And if NATO is the West, how can Turkey, for example, being in NATO? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great question. Tim first.
Okay, thank you. Ukraine. Would Putin have invaded Ukraine if Trump was president? I'll just leave that one there. I think, although when Nixon was president back in the 70s, there was this thing, they developed this thing called the madman principle, which was Henry Kissinger used to say to the Soviets, "Oh, you don't want to upset Nixon, he's absolutely nuts." And any provocation, he'll push the nuclear button. So, could a Trump White House have used this sort of madman, theory? NATO too dependent on the USA. That's why I've mentioned, AUKUS and Kanzuk and Japan. Recruitment. Does anybody remember that really? It was been on recent, or it was on a year ago. That really good Navy advert. I was born in Blythe, but I was made in the Royal Navy. And it was a really good advert. It was aspirational. It used a white bloke. Some people will resent me for saying that, but that is, I was talking with Simon about this, but that is the Army's traditional recruit. I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't make room for others, but that was a really, really good advert. It was aspirational, it made the bloke look good. He goes back to his hometown and everyone goes, "Oh, you're back, great, etc. Yada, yada. And lastly, the channel, and people talked about an invasion. I've always I've always felt a bit uncomfortable with that word. But I don't know, the way things are going, I'm struggling to think of what should we be calling it without necessarily calling it that. But it's ironic that in 1940 we managed to stop the Germans invading on Operation Sea Lion, but yet we can't stop dinghies coming. I mean, it just struck. I mean, not that I think sending in the Navy is the solution. High-sided warships are no good for that kind of thing. Anyway, those are my comments.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Sherelle.
Yeah, Harris versus Trump. I'll start with the more straightforward question first. I think, although, there's a question about, would Putin have invaded had Trump been president? But I think, frankly, the big difference between Harris and Trump is that Trump will immediately pull a plug on that war. Okay. And I think Democrats, he will pull the plug on American support for that war. Whereas I think Democrats will kick the can. It will be, drip feeding of artillery and trying to nudge Ukraine towards an off-ramp. So I think that will be kind of the difference between the two. Also with Iran, I think there's also a difference. I think that the Democrats Harris will be more traditional in terms of trying to contain that situation through a mixture of diplomacy and sort of trade and trying reviving the JCPOA. With all the kind of flaws within that, whereas I think Trump will attempt something that is sort of more robust, I guess, more sanctions-oriented. So there will be differences. Other questions, and there was a comment about elites sort of destroying the West. I think the thing is with sort of elites, I think about political elites. So they rely also on sort of the intellectuals at the time to feed them ideas. That Milton Friedman famously said, it's about whatever ideas are lying around at the time. And unfortunately, there are many ideas lying around for various reasons at the moment. And so, elites are sort of unable to sort of bring together new ideas of how we sort of tackle this new world that we find ourselves in. So it's also, we do like to bash sort of political elites, but it is a wider failure that's going on here. It also incorporates sort of universities as well. Interesting comment about multipolar society, whether we should sort of orient our thinking more towards that and not just be sort of blinkered by this dream of liberal unipolar dominance. Fair enough. And sometimes I do find myself sort of oscillating between sort of, the idea we have to protect the sort of quote unquote liberal order and thinking, well, isn't it time to just, confront the fact that we are living in this world of geopolitical fragmentation and you can't control everything that's going on. This merges this new civilization state order, sort of emergence, the Chinese civilization state, et cetera, and potentially other countries emerging. And
one last question.
Okay, yeah, that was just about the borders. I think this is quite interesting. I just think that I don't think it's either or. I think that we need to figure out a way to do both. I don't want it to sound it's like a wet liberal, but it is that the idea that we have to sort of ignore what's going on outside and just focus on controlling the borders is that sort of, it is the Roman Empire, that sort of loss of willing and being obsessed with the barbarians at the gate kind of mentality we have to avoid. We have to control our borders, but we also have to be looking at what's going on in the world as well. And that is kind of my fear with the Trumpist populism, but it's getting too insular in a way that's actually quite dangerous.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, Tim and Simon, answer what you like. Don't try and answer everything, but please, between you, address two unanswered questions. One about teaching of history in schools was raised, and the other one about, does the West have a collective identity? Is it NATO? And therefore, how come Turkey's part of it?
I'm going to answer one of the easier questions while I try desperately to think at the same time the answer to a more difficult question about the collective identity of the West and whether NATO represents it. So if I look even more confused than normal, that is why. I actually agree largely with what Sherelle said about the Harris versus Trump presidencies. But I think one thing to bear in mind about Trump is he's far more whimsical, far more capricious in his dealings on the world stage. And by that I mean he tends to see sort of international relations almost in terms of like personal relations, in terms of, the ability to strike a deal with his opposite number. That's how he tends to approach things. He will meet up with the XYZ leader and he will try to sit down and work out exactly what it is that they want and how they might be to come to sort of some sort of agreement. So you have the peculiarly sort of optimistic moment when he seems to be, Trump of all people seems to be on the brink of unifying Korea. That's just absolutely incredible. But so he has that in him. But by and large, he will at the same time continue some of the long-standing sort of policies of the US foreign policy making elite. I think the principal one, of course, is the antagonism and opposition to China. Trump continued, or he picked up where Obama had left off with the pivot to Asia. So in terms of like the major kind of structure and conflict, I think on the geopolitical scene between the US and China, I think Trump will continue where the Democrats have left off if he indeed wins the presidency. Now, thank God I can come back to the collective identity of the West. I was trying to think of this before I came to this, if I could define the West. And then I thought, I'll just try to dodge that. I think that would be the easiest thing to do. But the West isn't, as you're pretty aware, the West isn't a geographical identity. It's also not a fixed thing either. It's oddly enough, I think the West initially was defined by the Chinese. The idea of the West was actually not invented by the West. It was 2,000 years ago. The modern idea of the West sort of starts to develop and form with modernity itself. So the West becomes identified with modernity, with political, cultural, as well as sort of industrial and technological and economic modernity. So in that sense, the West is this kind of dynamic collective identity, because it's always bringing certain nations in as they modernize or they seem to identify with certain tenets of the West. Turkey is the principal example. Obviously, Kemal Ataturk. You've got this kind of westernizing, modernizing elite. So at that point, Turkey starts to be brought in under the umbrella of the West, and at that point, it starts to become a possible member of NATO. Obviously, under sort of Erdogan and his rather perhaps cynical turn towards a more sort of Islamic identity. Then you've got something because he seems to be turning against the political and cultural aspects of West modernity. So it starts to pull away again. So I think the best way to understand the West is as a constantly dynamic, emerging identity, which is identified, as far as I think Sam makes this point, with the most progressive aspects in the world. It's identified with progress, with modernity, and so on. So it's a dynamic, changing concept, bringing nations in, and at the same time as other nations start to fall away. Does NATO embody that? Not really. Tony was speaking to me beforehand. That NATO is what we have as the defensive military, a defensive military institution that represents the West. But it's far from perfect. It seems to be. It was clueless after the end of the Cold War. It was a Cold War institution designed explicitly to keep the US in Europe after the Second World War and to keep Russia out. So that was its function. And then after the end of the Cold War, it starts to lose a sense of itself. It becomes expansionist. It becomes interventionist. It starts to lose as it searches for it. So it searches for its sense of what it's doing. It starts to become more kind of capricious in its activities. It becomes more. It starts to cease to be a defensive organization. It becomes at various points slightly antagonistic. But to be honest, at the moment, that's the only collective defensive body that there is, which is NATO. So is as inadequate and as ineffective as it often is, it is all that exists right now. That's a terrible answer. I've really not done that.
Thank you, Tim. Sorry, thank you. Simon.
Yeah, great. I'll just take up that last point Jim made. I think absolutely right. That's why I say that the West originally, you've got to be in the East to identify where the West is, if you know what I mean. It's a bit like if you're in America, we talk about the Middle East, they talk about West Asia. But I would say when we think about the West, it's why I referred to it very much in inverted commas, because it is a progressive expansion of a geographical, ethnically based, religiously based, and then in the 16th century it expanded. There's no doubt about it. So, Australia and New Zealand are palpably in the West. Japan is in the West. The Philippines are a Catholic country. So this idea, I think it's gone from being a geographical the Commonwealth, you'd say many of those countries are inverted commas in the West. They might push against it. The Indians might have a feel. But I think it's when we say it, to an extent, it's a bit like certain other whatever's in life. You've got a broad idea of what you mean. It's a collection of ideas. But if you understand history as well, which I'm sure you are expert on as well, you can see where it's grown from a geographical expression, a religious historical expression, into I think one of progress. And of course, we straddle. The United Nations was born out of a sort of Western success at the end of the First World War. All the banking systems you say of the West, the whole of the world has this globalization that I referred to. So it's quite right not to talk about the West, and I think inverted commas. When I've used it, even writing it down, I wrote everything down with a inverted commas. But there's a Venn diagram where certain countries certainly fit into that, or others we identify as thinking similarly on that one. The Trump-Harris one is really important, because the West, we have traditionally thought of a leadership of the West, and that includes that wider West that I was talking to, has depended on the confidence, the sense of purpose that comes out of the White House fundamentally. I'm even just about old enough to remember, will certainly be through my parents, Kennedy. The sheer confident radiance. Now, I know they were about to go into the Vietnam War. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. I remember, whatever it is, bright new morning, Ronald Reagan. That's what I really remember, the Thatcher-Reagan confidence. And leadership requires purpose. It requires professionalism, and to my mind, requires communication. And we're deeply, deeply lacking that in, inverted commas, the West, and the traditional West, of perhaps the transatlantic link, and I think that's really terrible. So the Trump thing, I'm just going to go now. Part of that is the teaching of history. I'm absolutely passionate about teaching history properly. I say it's got to be factual, it's got to have context, and it's got to allow you then empathy. And I'm horrified when I talk. I don't have children, my brothers do, and I speak to them, and what do I find? No disrespect to the changing demographics of this country, but a young lady, product of good public school education, 25, when I said, what proportion of this country are white? 40%, she said. I got the church was a racist. 1943 Bengal famine. Any idea what was going on around it? Small thing called the Second World War. Not a chance. So this CRT stuff, this critical legal theory, the whole chipping away, and I remember what was the old Marxist cry? We don't need to win elections. We just need to dominate the institutions. Well, that is what our leaders, and I would absolutely point the finger at the Conservatives at this, have failed to make the fight. I know Sherelle talks
very often about it. Okay, Simon, no, sorry. We've got to go out. So just to explain the army in due course. You think size of. Right, okay. Reality is, it's a relatively short session. I want to get everybody in, which I will do. Keep it as short as you can. But speakers, be warned, you may only get 1 minute at the end, yeah? So that much. Yeah, because we got 15 minutes in which to do everything.
I'd like the panel to come clean. All of them have been lauding the values and the institutions, not of the West. The West doesn't exist. They've been lauding the values and institutions of the Anglo-American societies, the Anglosphere, English language civilization. That is what we belong to. The West, the Anglophones may have allies. Of course they have allies. Before you accuse me of being racist, I was brought up in German-speaking, Turkish-speaking, Italian-speaking communities and went to university in France. So I'm not saying this out of racism. I'm saying because it is the truth. And I like their comments on that.
Okay.
But secondly,
very
quickly, the AUKUS Pact worries me. Despite my feelings about Anglosphere civilization, the AUKUS Pact worries me. It is a way of dragging Britain into America's jealousy of China. Okay. Is China really our enemy?
I'm a child of the 70s and 80s, and I never remember worrying about nuclear war because of MAD, mutually assured destruction. There was something very comforting about knowing that if there was nuclear war, we were all going to die, so there wouldn't be nuclear war. And what worries me is this diabolical fear of nuclear war seems to be dissipating, and you get the impression that Putin and others believe they can survive it. And actually there can be such a thing as a limited nuclear war. I wonder if that's something you feel.
Great question, thank you. Yes, please.
I want to criticize the whole debate because I didn't realize, even when I came in, that it was going to be primarily a military with some politics thrown in debate. And then Sherelle brings up existential crisis. I thought we were going to go more into the cultural, spiritual, religious problems that young people are facing, etc., etc. The West is a lot more than just the military and politics. The problem is with the West, and I don't think you can have the two debates together. It's not enough time to do it.
Okay, so we have run out of time. We're nearly run out.
With all due respect.
We'll note the criticism. Thanks, yeah.
Similar sort of point that defense is more than just the armed forces. I'm thinking more in terms of supply chains, which are now kind of outsourced to a rival, if not an enemy. We've got key infrastructure being sort of bought up, the equity interests being in foreign hands. Our own energy is expensive and imported, and in the EU it is very expensive to produce, very hard to produce food. So with all those things taken into consideration, and they're all deliberate choices, do we have the means of defending ourselves, even if you forget about how bereft the armed forces are compared to 50 years ago?
In some ways, it's a similar point to what the chap at the front, the point he was just making. I'm really uncomfortable with the way that this has been posed, actually, because, I am a humanist. I believe in progress. I recognise and agree with the case for Western values, or I perhaps prefer to pose it as Enlightenment values. But I'm really not comfortable with conflating that with the UK and NATO's military history, which I've got massive problems with, including the actions in Kosovo, which were alluded to by did Tim say that? I can't remember who said it now. And so, I personally don't think those things go hand in hand. And I'm not sure that our elites have ever represented those humanist values that I hold. So I would defend them, and I would defend them to the death, but I'm not sure asking our elites to do that is the right course.
So one of the things I'm hearing is about, Western confidence in its own self. And historically, one of the things I've seen is how peoples from other countries around the world have fought off even, say, colonialism because they've seen those great things produced in the West and they want those things, okay? So, you can even look at Haiti, many of the struggles that people have fought for. And I'm just wondering, if we are no longer confident in our own, society, in our own Western values, will we no longer be able to inspire countries around the world to fight for those things as well?
Going back to the sort of internal existential issue, can the West be defended without the revival of small o Orthodox Christianity, so that the moral and cultural roots are renewed? I don't think the fruits of Christianity can survive without the tree from where it came, and there are people like Ian Hirsiali and others are starting to recognize that, and it hasn't been mentioned, but the spiritual, moral rot has to be addressed.
There's a lot of conflict in the world, obviously, and we have very limited resources. So what kind of parameters do you think that military and political leaders should be thinking about when deciding whether to interfere in an international conflict so that we temper potentially, these Russian actors or China, for example, but still protect our ability to defend ourselves?
Should the West get behind Israel to really take the opportunity now to take action against Iran's nuclear installations, given that arguably there is a small window of opportunity now?
Sherelle mentioned how some of our elites kind of look around for intellectual ideas that are kicking around. One of my pet hates is this notion of soft power and using so-called soft power to compensate for lack of investment in real hard power. If power if it's soft, it ain't power. And if it's power, it ain't soft. So I'd like the panel's opinions about this so-called soft power and what kind of use Shakespeare, for example, is in winning a war somewhere.
I think few people have touched on this from different perspectives, but I think that there's an important distinction to be drawn here between defense of the West, in quotation marks, as an ideology, as a philosophy, versus a defense of our national interests. And I think that very much from a military perspective, we need to be shameless in actually protecting our national interests. And that may mean making alliances with nations which aren't necessarily fully aligned with us, If you think back to the world wars, both of those were fought intra-West, if you use that defined terminology. You can go back throughout history, and actually it is not the civilizational clash, and I think that trying to make it a defense of the West as an ideology becomes almost a holy war type of scenario, and that I think we need to focus on what is in our interests as a nation.
I want to encourage the panel to also reflect on what you've already said, Tim, is we need to reinstate an importance in what values we are defending. If the military are going to defend something, they need to understand what we're defending. And I want to ask what specific values you want to be seen defended and how. Simon, you already alluded to how history in schools should be rethought, how it's taught, but I want to ask the rest of the panel how. I'll give an example that I come from a very rural background, and I see young farmers being a really important part of the community to give values to young people, and that's one example. What would you give?
Ewan Grant, United Kingdom Defence Forum. To the gentleman in the front row who asked about in what way is China a threat, I'd have a one-word answer: fentanyl. My question for all of you is, who is listening to you or coming to speak to you from across the ideological divide? In other words, to hear their views, your views, even if they're not particularly keen to hear them. Who's now reaching out to you, and by definition, who's closed to you?
Right, thanks to the audience, been fantastic. What's going to happen? I'm going to give you a minute each. So you're going to literally have to decide what your key messages are, right? Too much on the table, we need a whole conference. Tim, please.
Thank you, Tony. Well, folks, thanks for coming. It's been a great debate and a great discussion. I am, for the first time, worried about the future of our country. I think we've had governments in the past that I've always thought have had the national interest at heart. I'm not sure about that anymore. And I don't just mean this current government. And I think the same when it comes to our national security. I've always felt reasonably secure, as this gentleman here said. But now I'm not so sure. So I think this is potentially existential for us. And I think you can't divorce what's going on from the lack of confidence in ourselves and who we are and our willingness to defend it. What is the biggest threat in the world? Personally, I think it's a nuclear-armed Iran. I spoke earlier about the madman theory with Henry Kissinger and President Nixon. The mullahs might just be mad enough. That's my, we normally when we talk about this kind of thing, you're dealing with rational people. Well, I'm not sure that there we are.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Sherelle.
Yeah, it was very interesting, your comment about the sort of rupture in the West between sort of the Anglo idea of freedom and, continental. And I think that this speaks to something which I'm really interested in, just two utopias in the West. I'm afraid I'm going to use the F word, which is Foucault. But he saw that there were two utopias in the West, and the first one was the one that we all like to say that we believe in. It's all freedom enshrined in rights, and the other one was sort of this total medical bureaucratic world management in which everybody is controlled and nothing really escapes. But there's order, and you see that tension now coming to the fore. And there's a question: what makes us different to China? And I think China it will embody kind of the second dream. It is going to really, it's really driving towards that. And you can see that with this kind of nirvana that China is trying to build, which is one with not much freedom, but also virtually no crime. And so I think that we need to kind of discover how do we drive towards our own utopia, which I think is about freedom and liberty and rights. And I think that people are alarmed about the militarism. I'm also alarmed about that too. And that's why I tried to talk about AI in my sort of opening speech, because we need to try and nail what is it about AI that we are going to use that's going to be sort of uniquely Western. How are we going to liberate people? How are we going to enhance freedom? Because at the moment, when you have people like Palantir, who are both sort of running trying to run healthcare databases at the same time as becoming the world leader in spyware and Clearview, facial recognition being deployed on the battlefield. This is all Western technology. I mean, how are we different? How are we different? And I think that that's something that we really need to talk about. I've got no more time left, but that's really what I say. If you please go, I want you to go away with two utopias. They are rival within the West, and that's what the culture war is about. And we need to find a way to kind of gravitate the West towards the first utopia, which is liberty and rights.
Okay, thank you, Sherelle. Tim.
I am tempted to agree with the audience member who brought up the Enlightenment and, the audience member who identified the West, if you like, with the Enlightenment and Western values, because I think that's key. I think I was conceived actually of this discussion not as a particularly military discussion, which was just as well because I know bugger all about tanks and missiles. So I always saw it as it should be a discussion about, it should be a debate about what it is that is worth defending in the West, because that seems to me to be the principal crisis we are faced with right now. That is what we are staring in the face, and my rather primitive attempt to address that question, I think, is to think of a defense of the West as being a defense of certain Enlightenment ideals. Like the very idea of Western modernity and the very idea of civilization as being something you can almost start to identify with the West was an Enlightenment conception. It starts to emerge during the Enlightenment. So I think to defend the West, you actually do start to need to start to defend and take seriously and think through Enlightenment ideals. And I think the most principal one is autonomy, I think, both individual and collective, which leads to forms of self-determination. Because those ideals are dynamic. They have motored social change and social progress for centuries, and I think they can still do. So I think if we are to defend the West, we need to start to defend those universal ideals which were articulated during the Enlightenment and should still have a lasting impact today. And I was going to mention something about national service and popular militias. I'm just joking, Tony.
Now signing. Yeah, I will. I think the gentleman's point at the front about the Anglos here is well made. It was supposed to be British time, American money, and Russian blood, and one accepts that. But it was our ability to defeat Nazism that defended Western Europe. We then were able to face down the Russians. Communist China wasn't that much of a threat. And reunify Europe and continue to expand. So we shouldn't be, part of our problem is we become embarrassed about if we should. We back to the West having the confidence in what it's achieved and what it's allowed. I think your point is the gentleman at the front about not wanting this to be a military issue. There was a quote I had here, which was from Gibbon about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. It was because the Roman Empire ceased to have the confidence or the capacity to defend itself, within which all the fruits of prosperity and leisure were allowed to go. And as I opened my talk, 1,000 years before we built a house for pleasure again. So you're absolutely right. We define the West by our achievements on the cultural society, the left or front as well. But if we don't defend them...
I agree.
That's the point I would make. But without defending them, then we have a thing of expectations, and that's the problem we've got at the moment. So I'll select these, and the two questions: when we want to criticize the West or Britain or whatever, compared to what? And when we look at Ukraine or Israel, who do you want to win? We need leadership, and we certainly need a new narrative that captures the main points that we've come out of, things that we should be highly proud of, but rather threat. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you.